Not all deaths are equal. Some vanish without a trace, while This journey does not rush. It begins with a single life caught in the snow and slowly unfolds into massacres, crusades, and burning pyres. As we follow these remains, we will see how fear reshaped history, how violence became ritual, and how death itself turned into testimony. High in the Ötztal Alps, at an altitude where storms gather suddenly and glaciers press like frozen rivers against jagged stone, two hikers stumbled on a dark shape protruding from melting ice. It was September 1991, and at first they assumed they had found a modern climber, perhaps a victim of a recent accident. Yet when officials retrieved the body, its appearance was startlingly strange. The skin was darkened, leathery. The clothes were stitched not from nylon or wool, but from animal hide. Near the corpse lay tools, an axe with a gleaming copper blade, a dagger chipped from flint, and a quiver with unfinished arrows. This was not the body of a lost tourist. It was the preserved remains of a man who had lived more than 5 millennia ago. He became known simply as Ötzi, named after the valley where he was discovered. From the beginning, his preservation was extraordinary. Radiocarbon dating placed his life around 3300 BCE, in the late Neolithic to early Copper Age, making him the oldest natural mummy ever found in Europe. Unlike skeletons in graves, Ötzi was encased in a frozen environment that shielded even the soft tissues. His skin, organs, and even the contents of his stomach survived. For archaeologists, this was not merely a body, it was a time capsule. The clothing alone astonished researchers. His coat was made from goat hide stitched with sinew. His leggings were crafted from deerskin. His shoes contained grass fibers for insulation. Each piece revealed a sophisticated knowledge of tailoring, materials, and adaptation to harsh climates. His axe was equally remarkable. Copper smelted and cast at a time when most communities still relied on stone. Metallurgical analysis showed the copper originated from ores hundreds of kilometers away, suggesting trade networks already linked Alpine valleys. The presence of such an object implied that Ötzi was not an ordinary herder, but someone of status, entrusted with tools rare in his era. At first, speculation about his death was simple. Many thought he had perished in a storm, overcome by cold and exhaustion. The Alps had claimed countless lives before. Why not this one? But careful examination soon challenged that view. A small incision between his thumb and index finger indicated a defensive wound, perhaps received in combat. Bruising on his head suggested a fall or blow, and then, years after his discovery, medical imaging revealed the most damning evidence. A stone arrowhead lodged deep in his left shoulder. It had pierced a major artery. Death would have followed within minutes. The forensic details transformed the narrative. Ötzi was not merely a victim of nature. He had been killed. To understand how, researchers examined his body with every tool modern science could provide. CT scans reconstructed his injuries in 3 dimensions. Microscopic analysis identified red blood cells around the wound, the oldest ever observed. Radiocarbon dating calibrated against tree ring sequences confirmed his era with remarkable precision. Even the pollen grains trapped in his clothing told a seasonal story. He had died in early autumn, just as snow began to reclaim the mountains. Inside his stomach and intestines, chemical and microscopic analysis revealed his final meal. Red deer meat, ibex, einkorn wheat, and traces of herbs formed a surprisingly rich diet. He had eaten only hours before death, eliminating the idea of slow starvation. Stable isotope analysis of strontium in his teeth revealed the regions he had traveled through in childhood, and those signatures matched the valleys surrounding the discovery site. He was not a foreign wanderer. He was local, embedded in the landscape, yet his last journey had taken him higher into danger. As these data accumulated, the image of a tragic accident faded. What emerged instead was the outline of a crime scene. A man equipped with advanced tools, clothed in carefully crafted garments, carrying the knowledge of medicine and fire, fell not to weather, but to violence. The copper axe was left untouched. His arrows remained. Robbery did not explain it. The defensive wound on his hand hinted at a fight before the ambush. The arrow through his shoulder was execution, not misfortune. In that frozen moment, 5,000 years ago, Ötzi had become Europe's oldest murder victim. And as science uncovered more, the story grew darker. Who had loosed the arrow? Why was the axe left behind? Did betrayal come from strangers, or from within his own circle? The questions remained. But what was certain, even at this early stage, was that his death was deliberate and his preservation accidental. The glacier had entombed him, locking away evidence that would one day reopen a case older than history itself. When Ötzi's body arrived in the laboratory, the first task was to stabilize him. He was placed inside a chamber that mimicked the cold, humid conditions of a glacier. Without this, the tissues that had survived for millennia could have decayed within days. Scientists understood they were not just handling a mummy. They were curating an archaeological treasure with potential to rewrite our understanding of prehistoric Europe. Every object found with him was catalogued. The copper axe underwent metallurgical testing, revealing a purity of over 99% copper, far higher than later Bronze Age tools. The blade had been cast and hammered into shape, suggesting a sophisticated knowledge of smelting. Lead isotope analysis traced the metal's origin to southern Tuscany, nearly 500 kilometers away. The implication was staggering. Networks of exchange already stretched across Europe long before written records. His quiver contained unfinished arrows. Some were mere shafts. Others had flint tips roughly attached. One arrow was complete, but broken. Microscopic wear analysis indicated that at least one had been used in hunting, but none of them matched the fatal arrowhead discovered in his shoulder. Whoever shot him did not use his own weapons. The clothing told its own story. Using scanning electron microscopes, textile specialists identified specific animal hairs: goat, sheep, and even bear. These were layered for insulation, stitched together with sinew. His shoes were a marvel of prehistoric design, constructed from deer skin, with a bearskin sole and grass fibers acting as padding. Reproductions of these shoes proved remarkably effective in tests, outperforming many modern hiking boots in cold conditions. Clearly, Ötzi had not been a careless wanderer. He was equipped with knowledge of materials and environments. Attention soon turned back to his body. CT scans revealed not only the embedded arrowhead but also internal trauma. The arrow had torn through the subclavian artery, ensuring rapid exsanguination. A large hematoma around the wound confirmed catastrophic bleeding. No treatment marks were found, meaning he had no chance of survival once struck. Yet the arrow was not his only injury. The laceration on his right hand measured nearly 2 centimeters, consistent with a cut from a blade. Bone bruises on his skull suggested a fall or blunt force impact. These injuries, likely sustained within a day of his death, hinted at prior conflict. He had already been in danger before the final arrow struck. One of the most revealing lines of evidence came from his digestive tract. Samples of his stomach and intestines were carefully extracted and examined. Researchers found chunks of ibex meat with intact muscle fibers, einkorn wheat grains, and traces of fat. Mass spectrometry showed he had eaten this meal only 2 to 3 hours before death. Alongside these were pollen grains from hop hornbeam, a tree that blooms at specific altitudes during late spring and early summer. The pollen's freshness suggested he had recently moved from lower valleys before climbing again into the high pass. Stable isotope analysis added further depth. Strontium signatures in his bones revealed a childhood spent in the lower Isarco Valley, while his adult years showed mobility across multiple Alpine regions. Oxygen isotopes in his tooth enamel corresponded to local water sources, confirming that he had lived and traveled extensively within this region. He was not an outsider passing through, but a man deeply tied to the land. DNA sequencing, conducted decades after his discovery, illuminated even more. His genome showed predispositions for cardiovascular disease and arthritis. Indeed, calcification in his arteries confirmed heart strain. Microscopic parasites discovered in his intestines explained chronic abdominal pain. These details mattered. Ötzi was a man whose health limited him. He was slower than others, unable to run far, an easy target for a determined enemy. But perhaps the most unsettling discovery came from blood traces on his belongings. Protein analysis revealed 4 distinct human blood groups on his tools and clothing. On his dagger, traces of one individual. On an arrow shaft, the blood of another. On his coat, still others. The evidence implied he had been involved in a confrontation shortly before his death, wounding or even killing multiple opponents. The forensic picture was now layered, a man carrying signs of disease but armed with advanced tools, a man who had eaten a full meal before fleeing or climbing, a man already injured, possibly from combat, and finally, a man felled by an arrow from behind. The sequence suggested not chance but pursuit. Archaeologists debated what it all meant. Was this tribal warfare? A political betrayal? A failed negotiation turned violent? Each explanation had merit, but none fit perfectly. What they agreed upon was this: Ötzi had not died in isolation. His death was the culmination of human conflict, preserved in ice. The arrow in Ötzi's shoulder was a fact. Its interpretation was not. Like detectives faced with incomplete evidence, scientists debated what the crime scene meant. Multiple theories rose and collided, each one built from fragments of data, each one shedding light on the world of 3300 BCE. One possibility was intertribal conflict. The late Neolithic period was far from peaceful. Archaeological sites across Europe reveal fortified settlements, stockpiles of weapons, and mass graves with trauma on bones. Communities guarded their valleys fiercely. To carry a copper axe, rare and valuable, was to carry both prestige and risk. Perhaps Ötzi wandered into contested ground. The fatal arrow may have come from enemies protecting territory or seeking to eliminate a rival. Another possibility was betrayal closer to home. Social dynamics in small communities were fraught. Leadership could be challenged, jealousy simmered beneath alliances, and disputes often turned bloody. Ötzi's equipment, tattoos, and medicinal fungi hinted at special status, possibly as a leader, healer, or warrior elder. If so, his power might have inspired envy. The wound on his hand, fresh from combat, could mark an earlier quarrel. If his killer knew him personally, the silence of the mountains may have hidden not just a murder but a coup. A third theory emphasized pursuit. The isotopic and pollen evidence suggested Ötzi had moved rapidly between low valleys and high passes in his final days. Why? Perhaps he was fleeing. Blood from at least 4 different individuals on his weapons implied a violent confrontation before his death. Maybe he had defended himself, striking back, wounding others. If so, the arrow in his shoulder may have been the final act of a running conflict, a hunted man brought down after escaping once already. Science provided pieces, but not the whole. His tattoos, etched with soot into his skin, told yet another part of the story. Over 60 marks ran along his spine, knees, and ankles. Later studies mapped them against acupuncture points. They aligned with areas that would have eased pain in his arthritic joints. This raised the image of a man who was both a sufferer and a survivor, carrying his ailments up the mountain even as his enemies closed in. The context of his world cannot be ignored. This was a Europe in transition, shifting from stone to metal, from isolated bands to wider networks. His copper axe, traced by isotopic analysis to Tuscan ore, proved he was part of those networks. Trade routes carried not only materials, but rivalries. Control over copper meant control over status and power. To strike down the man who carried such a weapon was to make a statement, a political act wrapped in violence. Forensic anthropology supplied chilling details. The arrow that killed him had entered from behind and above, implying that the shooter had the advantage of elevation. It was not a desperate shot, but a calculated one. Blood loss would have been rapid, consciousness slipping away in moments. The cut on his hand showed he had defended himself earlier, but by the time of the fatal strike, he had no chance to resist. And yet, contradictions remained. Why was the axe not taken? Why were his belongings left untouched? Robbery could not explain his death. Ritual sacrifice seemed unlikely. His burial was accidental, not ceremonial. Instead, what remains most plausible is targeted violence, an act rooted in human motives as old as society itself: revenge, rivalry, power. For modern audiences, the fascination with Ötzi lies not only in the mystery, but in the familiarity. Strip away the millennia, and his story mirrors crimes we recognize today. A man with resources and status becomes a target. Conflict escalates. A wound marks his struggle. A weapon ends his life. The details change. The arrow replaced by a gun, the Alpine pass by a city street, but the pattern remains. What Ötzi teaches us is that violence is not an invention of modernity. It is woven into human history, preserved in the archaeological record. His body, frozen in time, is evidence not just of his own murder, but of the universality of conflict. In the silence of the ice, his death reverberates. The glacier did not merely preserve a corpse, it preserved a story. A man pursued, a life taken, a crime never confessed. The final hours of Ötzi's life can now be traced not only through speculation, but through science. Radiological imaging shows the arrow's path, entering from behind, angled downward, piercing the subclavian artery. Forensic models calculate that he would have lost consciousness within minutes, death following swiftly. Around the wound, preserved tissue displays hematomas, confirming bleeding at the moment of impact. In one sense, it was a precise and efficient killing. Yet other evidence paints a more desperate scene. The deep cut on his hand was not the kind of injury sustained in hunting. It was defensive, inflicted when he grasped at a blade or struggled against an opponent. The bruising on his skull suggests he had already fallen or been struck. Taken together, these marks imply that his last climb into the Alps was not a peaceful journey, but the aftermath of conflict. He may have fled upward, searching for refuge among the glaciers. Instead, he was trapped and struck down. His stomach contents add an almost haunting detail. Scientists know that within 2 to 3 hours of his death, he ate a full meal, ibex meat rich in fat, grains of einkorn, and herbs used for flavor or medicine. Microscopic examination of pollen shows he had come from a valley environment where hornbeam trees bloomed, then ascended rapidly into higher altitudes. In other words, he was not starving or exhausted. He was fed, alert, still carrying his tools. His death was sudden, imposed, and inescapable. The tattoos on his body, often dismissed as decoration, remind us of his humanity. 60 black marks run across joints and the spine, corresponding to points used in acupuncture. Whether ritual or medical, they reveal a man coping with pain, arthritis, heart disease, parasites. His body was not the body of a strong young warrior, but of an older man, slowed yet still resilient. His survival up to that final climb speaks of endurance. His fall to violence speaks of betrayal. Forensic analysis of blood residues left another chilling clue. At least 4 other human blood types were present on his weapons and clothing. His dagger carried the blood of one individual. An arrow shaft bore another. His coat carried still more. This evidence strongly suggests a violent encounter before his death. He may have fought, wounded, even killed. He was not only a victim, he was a participant in conflict. His last breath on the mountain may have followed hours of pursuit and struggle. Imagine him in those final moments. The mountain air thin, his breath labored, his body already weary from age and disease, his hand cut and bleeding, his head sore from impact. He climbs higher, believing perhaps that distance equals safety. But safety does not come. The archer has the advantage of height. A bow is drawn, the arrow loosed, and history changes. He collapses, his lifeblood staining the snow. The copper axe glints beside him, untouched by the killers. His belongings scatter in the frost. The storm begins, and with it, the slow burial of his body under ice. For centuries, for millennia, he remains hidden. What was meant to erase him instead preserved him, freezing not just flesh but evidence. Today, visitors stare at his body in a chilled chamber in South Tyrol. They see a man curled in death, lips parted, skin darkened by time. He does not look peaceful. He looks interrupted, as if death arrived too quickly to grant closure. And in truth, it did. His story is incomplete, his murder unresolved. But in that incompleteness lies his power. Ötzi is no longer just an archaeological specimen. He is the first witness we can touch of humanity's oldest crime, murder. His body bridges past and present, reminding us that envy, rivalry, and violence have been with us since the beginning. The tools change, stone arrow, steel blade, gun, but the impulse does not. And if the murder of one man on a lonely mountain could echo across 5,000 years, what happens when violence strikes a king? What happens when power itself becomes the target? Our next case descends from ice into desert, from a hidden pass in the Alps to the golden tombs of Egypt. There, a pharaoh's skull carries its own silent testimony. The body lay in its coffin, wrapped in ancient linen, but no amount of bandages could hide what had happened. When archaeologists first unwrapped the mummy of Pharaoh Seqenenre II, they were not met with the serene visage of a divine ruler, but with the horror of a face broken by violence. His nose had collapsed, his jaw was fractured, and deep wounds cut across his skull. Unlike other pharaohs, whose embalming masked the cruelty of death, Seqenenre's corpse testified openly. This was not a natural passing. This was execution. Seqenenre II ruled Thebes around 1550 BCE, a turbulent period when Egypt was divided. In the north, the Hyksos, foreign rulers from Asia, held the Nile Delta. In the south, Thebes remained independent, resisting domination. Seqenenre's reign was short, and history remembers him not for monuments or prosperity, but for the mystery of his death. Early observers in the 19th century noticed the wounds, but could not explain them. Was this pharaoh killed in battle, or assassinated in his palace? Modern science would eventually give more precise answers. CT scans, 3D modeling, and forensic anthropology revealed not random damage, but systematic blows from multiple weapons. The story that emerged was darker than anyone expected. The injuries mapped across his head read like a forensic report. One gash ran straight across the forehead. Its clean, sharp edge matched the blade of a bronze axe. Another puncture sat just behind the left ear, consistent with a spear thrust. The cheekbone had caved inward, fractures radiating into the jaw, evidence of a crushing strike, likely from a mace. And at the back of his skull, another massive cleft revealed a final, fatal blow. The sequence was not the chaos of battle. It was the precision of execution. Even more disturbing was what his body did not show. There were no defensive wounds on his arms or hands, no signs that he had tried to block or deflect the weapons. His posture suggested rigidity at the wrists, leading forensic pathologists to propose that he may have been bound when he died. This was not the death of a warrior defending his throne. It was the death of a prisoner. The embalming confirmed the humiliation. While most pharaohs were preserved with care, organs removed, resins applied, wrappings layered with ritual, Seqenenre's preparation was rushed. His body showed signs of decomposition before embalming even began. The wrappings were irregular, resin largely absent. It seemed as if his attendants had worked in haste, struggling to cover the odor of decay. Egyptologists suggest that his corpse may have been returned late, perhaps from a battlefield or from enemy captivity, leaving priests no time to perform proper rites. For a king, this was dishonor. The pharaoh, considered a god on earth, had been buried like a fallen soldier, his wounds left exposed for eternity. The political context adds weight to this forensic picture. Seqenenre's Thebes was the last bastion against Hyksos rule. If he died at their hands, his execution was not only an act of violence, but of symbolism. To shatter the head of a pharaoh was to declare that Egypt's gods could be broken. Power was not divine, power could bleed. And yet, for all this scientific clarity, the mystery persists. Was Seqenenre captured in open battle and executed as a prisoner of war? Or did betrayal rise from within Thebes itself, his own courtiers turning against him? The wounds do not answer motive. They only show the method. What is certain is this: Seqenenre II, once the living god of Thebes, died like a man surrounded by enemies. His skull was his epitaph, written not in words but in fractures. The scientific investigation of Seqenenre II's death reads like a cold case file reopened after more than 3 millennia. With CT scanners acting as virtual autopsy tools, researchers were able to peer beneath his bandages without disturbing them. The imagery was conclusive. This pharaoh had suffered at least 5 distinct head injuries, each inflicted while he was still alive. The first blow carved a deep wound across the forehead, its sharpness characteristic of a bronze battle axe. Unlike later Egyptian axes designed for ceremony, this was a weapon for war, heavy and practical. The second wound, just behind the left ear, was a narrow puncture that penetrated bone. Forensic comparisons with Hyksos weaponry suggested a bronze spear. The third wound crushed his right cheekbone, sending fractures across the jaw, as if a rounded mace head had slammed against him. The fourth, at the back of his skull, split bone so severely that brain matter would have been instantly destroyed. A fifth wound, less obvious, ran along the side of his head, reinforcing the impression that multiple assailants struck from different angles. Together, these injuries painted a picture of systematic killing. A single attacker could not have delivered blows so varied and from so many positions. Seqenenre had been surrounded, restrained, and methodically slaughtered. The absence of defensive wounds strengthened this conclusion. His hands showed no cuts, no fractures. His forearms bore no marks of shielding against weapons. Forensic pathologists suggested rigor mortis locked his wrists in a bent position at the time of discovery, consistent with arms bound at death. If so, this was execution, not combat. The embalming details supported the story of haste. Normally, pharaohs were mummified with elaborate care, organs removed, resins applied, linen layered with ritual precision. Seqenenre's body showed none of this. Decomposition had begun before embalming, suggesting that his corpse was retrieved late, possibly after lying in the open. Resin traces were minimal, wrappings uneven. This was not the preparation of a god, but the covering of a problem. His attendants had been forced to hide a stinking body, evidence of dishonor they could not erase. Context sharpened the forensic results. Seqenenre ruled at a time when the Hyksos dominated Lower Egypt. They controlled the Nile Delta, ruling from their capital at Avaris, while Thebes in the south stood as a bastion of resistance. Ancient sources describe hostility between Seqenenre and the Hyksos king Apophis. One tale, though likely apocryphal, claims that Apophis sent absurd demands to Seqenenre, such as removing noisy hippopotamuses in Thebes, an insult meant to provoke war. Whether legend or propaganda, the conflict was real. Seqenenre's death coincided with the earliest phases of open rebellion. The weapon evidence pointed strongly toward Hyksos involvement. The axe and mace injuries matched weapons excavated from Avaris, not Thebes. If he died in battle, the scenario of capture and execution was plausible. Taken alive, restrained, struck repeatedly in front of witnesses, such an end would have been theater as much as killing, a public demonstration that resistance was futile. Yet some Egyptologists offered another theory. Could his own courtiers have murdered him in a palace coup, then blamed the Hyksos? The haste of his burial, the lack of ritual, might also signal political instability within Thebes. A ruler weakened by conflict, struggling for authority, could have been eliminated by ambitious rivals. Still, most evidence favored external enemies. The distribution of wounds, the absence of robbery or mutilation, and the Hyksos weapon signatures suggested battlefield capture. Forensic models reconstructed him kneeling, arms bound, surrounded by enemy soldiers. One axe descended first, splitting the forehead. He staggered, unable to raise arms. A spear pierced behind the ear. A mace crushed the jaw. A final axe cleaved the back of his head. The sequence lasted seconds, but its brutality still resonates millennia later. The significance of such a death cannot be overstated. Pharaohs were considered divine, embodiments of gods on earth. To execute one publicly was to desecrate divinity itself. If Seqenenre fell this way, his death was not just personal, but cosmic. The Hyksos had not only defeated a man, they had symbolically broken Egypt's gods. And yet, in breaking him, they may have sown their downfall. His successors, Kamose and Amose, would wage the wars that expelled the Hyksos, founding the new kingdom. Seqenenre's shattered skull became a rallying cry. His dishonor, transmuted by time, became the seed of vengeance. If the forensic evidence revealed the method of Seqenenre's death, the broader context revealed its meaning. For ancient Egyptians, a pharaoh's body was not just mortal flesh. It was a sacred vessel that carried divine essence. To strike it was sacrilege. To mutilate it was an assault not only on a man, but on the gods themselves. Seqenenre's execution, then, was more than a killing. It was a political message. By surrounding him and striking his head repeatedly, his enemies emphasized humiliation. The ruler of Thebes, once adorned with a crown, died kneeling beneath foreign weapons. In the Hyksos narrative, his broken skull symbolized Egypt's submission. Archaeologists and historians see this as one of the most dramatic cases of political theater in antiquity. The setting may have been public, with soldiers, courtiers, or captives witnessing the act. The multiple weapons, delivered from different angles, suggest participation by several executioners, perhaps Hyksos officers taking turns, each blow a demonstration of dominance. Unlike battlefield deaths, which could be concealed, this was ritual exposure. A ruler was reduced to an example. But in Egypt, symbols are slippery. What was meant as humiliation later became inspiration. His broken body was carried back to Thebes, where priests wrapped it hastily. His people saw the wounds not as shame, but as martyrdom. Later, pharaohs, Kamose and Ahmose, would channel that memory into vengeance, transforming dishonor into legitimacy for rebellion. The violent death of a ruler is not unique to ancient Egypt. More than 2,000 years later, in 1918, another sovereign faced a similarly brutal end, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. Like Seqenenre, Nicholas was a symbol of divine authority in his realm. And like Seqenenre, his death was staged as a demonstration of power. On a July night in Yekaterinburg, Nicholas and his family were led into a basement, told they were being moved. Instead, soldiers opened fire. Bullets, bayonets, and smoke filled the room. When the guns fell silent, the dynasty was gone. The bodies were buried hastily, lime poured to speed decay. Forensic science later recovered their remains. DNA analysis confirmed identities. Ballistics reconstructed the fatal shots. Just as CT scans mapped Seqenenre's fractures, modern tools revealed the truth hidden in bone. Both men, though separated by millennia, died in ways meant to erase dignity. Both were turned from rulers into examples. The parallel reminds us regicide is never just about killing. It is about dismantling symbols. To slay a king or a pharaoh is to proclaim that no divine right is untouchable. Returning to Seqenenre, his wounds preserved the same truth. The Hyksos may have sought to prove that pharaohs were mortal, vulnerable, conquerable. But in time, his people saw the opposite. His shattered skull testified to cruelty, fueling hatred that boiled into resistance. The man they sought to erase became the martyr who ignited liberation. In forensic terms, Seqenenre's wounds prove capture and execution. In cultural terms, they prove something deeper, that symbols, even when broken, retain power. The Hyksos struck his skull to silence Egypt. Instead, the fractures shouted louder than any victory. The final moments of Seqenenre Tau can be reconstructed with unsettling precision. Digital forensic models combining CT scans and weapon comparisons recreate the execution scene in chilling detail. The pharaoh is on his knees, his arms bound behind him. Torches flicker, shadows cast against mud brick walls. Around him stand his captors, Hyksos soldiers, weapons in hand, waiting their turn. The axe comes first, its bronze edge cutting down through his forehead. Blood runs hot under the desert night air. His head jerks, but his arms cannot rise. A spear follows, driven into the side of his skull behind the ear. He gasps, teeth gritted, but still lives. Then the mace descends, crushing his cheekbone, splintering teeth, fracturing the jaw. His mouth collapses into silence. The final axe cleaves the back of his skull, extinguishing the breath of a king who once carried divine authority. In the quiet after, his body slumps. What was once Pharaoh, the living Horus, son of Ra, now lies as a prisoner discarded. His captors have not merely killed him, they have dismantled an idea. Kings bleed, gods can be broken. The embalming confirms that haste followed horror. Priests in Thebes received his body days later, already decomposing. They wrapped what they could, skipping sacred steps. Resin was absent. Rituals were rushed. The goal was concealment, not glorification. His burial lacked the majesty of royal tradition. It was survival, an attempt to salvage dignity from dishonor. And yet, paradoxically, this dishonor became power. To later Thebans, Seqenenre's wounds were not weakness but testimony. His skull, fractured in 5 places, became proof of cruelty. His failure to defend himself became evidence of martyrdom. His body, instead of silencing rebellion, fueled it. Within a generation, Kamose and Amose would avenge him, driving the Hyksos from Egypt and founding the new kingdom. Science gives us measurements, the angle of an axe strike, the depth of a puncture, the absence of defensive wounds. But story gives us meaning. What his body tells is not only how he died, but why his death mattered. Violence that was meant to erase a pharaoh's divinity instead amplified it. The museum today holds him in sterile glass, his face still frozen in agony. Visitors see fractures that ancient embalmers could not hide. Where gilded masks present eternal serenity, Seqenenre presents truth. His head is a battlefield, his bones a document. He has become, unexpectedly, the most honest pharaoh of them all, his body unedited, his story undeniable. Standing before him, one feels not only the weight of history, but the echo of mortality. If a god-king could be bound and beaten, what of ordinary men? If a pharaoh's skull could split under bronze, what of his people? But kings are not the only victims whose deaths leave echoes. Sometimes entire communities are swallowed by violence, their cries lost to stone and legend. In the medieval city of York, a well still whispers of such a night. Torches burned, doors slammed, voices begged for mercy, and silence followed. Hundreds perished together, not in royal execution but in mass despair. From the broken skull of a pharaoh, we descend into the darkness of a well where history still murmurs with screams. What does it mean when dozens of young men lie together in the earth, stripped of weapons, stripped of honor, stripped of memory? Are they warriors who died in battle or captives executed in cold blood? This is the question that emerged in 2009, when construction workers in Oxford uncovered a pit filled with bones. Beneath the soil of St. John's College, archaeologists found at least 35 skeletons. Almost all were young men, aged between their late teens and mid-20s. Their bodies were tangled, limbs overlapping, skulls resting at odd angles. Unlike Viking graves known from Scandinavia, which often contained swords, shields, jewelry, or even boats, these burials offered nothing. The dead were thrown into the pit with no markers, no possessions, no sign of ceremony. The condition of the remains was striking. Several skulls were fractured, split by sharp cuts or smashed by blunt force. Vertebrae bore clean slices, as if heads had been severed deliberately. Some femurs carried marks of chopping blows. In a few places, bones bore traces of burning, but not the complete incineration of a funeral pyre. Instead, the partial charring suggested a fire that was started and abandoned, or applied in haste. From the beginning, archaeologists recognized that this was not a battlefield grave. The careful rows and ritual gestures that usually marked warrior burials were absent. Instead, the Oxford pit looked like disposal, mass killing followed by hurried burial. The question was why? Radiocarbon dating placed the remains in the late 10th or early 11th century CE, aligning with one of the most violent chapters in Anglo-Saxon history. During this period, Viking raids were relentless. Longships crossed the North Sea, their crews seeking silver, slaves, and glory. In response, Anglo-Saxon rulers grew harsher, ordering reprisals not only against raiding parties, but against entire communities of Danes settled in England. Historical sources offer grim parallels. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes the St. Brice's Day massacre of 1002 CE, when King Ethelred ordered the killing of Danes throughout his kingdom. Some chronicles suggest entire families were cut down, their bodies discarded without ceremony. Could the Oxford pit be linked to this event? The dating was close enough to raise the possibility. Yet the evidence also pointed toward another scenario: captured raiders executed together. The lack of women or children in the pit suggested a military group. The age range of the men, late teens to 20s, matched the profile of Viking crews, young, mobile, drawn to risk. Their skeletons carried no signs of long illness. These were healthy men. Their lives ended suddenly. Standing at the edge of that pit today, the scene invites reconstruction. Imagine the moment. A raiding party lands, expecting plunder, but is caught instead. The locals rally quickly, closing escape routes. The raiders are surrounded, stripped of weapons, bound. Perhaps they are marched inland, jeered at by villagers. Perhaps the execution is deliberate spectacle, a warning written in blood. One by one, blows fall. Some clean, some clumsy. Heads separate from spines. Bones crack. When it is finished, the bodies are tossed into the pit, ash scattered over them, soil shoveled to cover the site. This picture, drawn from archaeology and history, carries both certainty and ambiguity. The bones speak of violence, but not motive. Were these men punished as criminals, sacrificed in ritual, or eliminated as enemies of the crown? The evidence allows multiple readings, each grim in its own way. What remains undeniable is the message left behind. Whoever killed these men wanted them forgotten. No names inscribed, no treasures buried, no cairns raised. They were to be erased, their deaths swallowed by the earth. And yet, centuries later, the soil betrayed its secret. The pit, intended to hide, now tells a story louder than any monument. In the laboratory, where bright light replaced the soil and silence of the grave, the skeletons began to speak. Each tooth, each vertebra, each scar carved into bone became a record of the past. Science, patient and deliberate, transformed the jumble of the Oxford pit into testimony. The first task was to ask who these men were and where they had come from. Tooth enamel, formed in childhood and never altered, holds the chemical memory of water and food from those early years. Oxygen and strontium isotopes taken from the enamel pointed not to the chalky soils of southern England, but to cooler climates and harder bedrock. The values suggested origins in Scandinavia, from Norway and Sweden to Denmark. The pattern was scattered, not concentrated in a single region, indicating that these men had been gathered from diverse places. This matches what is known of Viking raiding parties, which were often formed seasonally, composed of young men drawn from different communities, and bound together by ambition rather than blood. Bone collagen gave another layer of evidence. Unlike enamel, collagen changes during life and reflects diet in the last decade or so. The analysis revealed elevated nitrogen and marine-leaning carbon values, consistent with a diet heavy in fish and salted meat. These were not farmers tied to one field. They were men of the sea, their bodies carrying the imprint of voyages and salt. A few showed slightly lower marine values, perhaps men who had lived inland for a time. But the overall picture was unmistakable. The question then shifted from identity to cause of death. Several cervical vertebrae bore deep and precise cuts at the back of the neck. These were not glancing wounds. They were sharp, deliberate strikes made while the bone still retained moisture, proving they were perimortem. Some necks showed a single, efficient slice. Others displayed multiple parallel cuts, each slightly misaligned, as if the executioner hesitated or needed several attempts. The skulls told their own story of violence. Some carried sharp force trauma, deep, V-shaped cuts from axes or swords. Others bore blunt force injuries, radiating cracks from heavy blows, with bone pushed inward. In several cases, both types of trauma appeared on the same head. One man was struck with an axe and then finished with a mace. This variability showed that the killings were not uniform. Some were executed cleanly, others suffered a brutal mixture of methods. One striking absence was the lack of defensive injuries. The bones of the forearm, which often break when a victim raises an arm to block a strike, were intact. Hands and fingers showed no cuts from clutching at blades. These men had not fought back. The simplest explanation is that they were restrained, bound, or forced to kneel when the blades fell. The neat cuts to the neck reinforced that image of controlled killing. The condition of the burial added further evidence. The bodies had been thrown into the pit in a chaotic heap. Limbs twisted, heads detached from necks, bones tangled together. Some bones bore traces of burning, turning dark brown or black, but the fire had not consumed them fully. It was uneven and incomplete, not the organized cremation of a pyre, but a partial burning, perhaps started for humiliation or cleansing, then abandoned. The age profile was equally telling. Most of the men were between 18 and 25 years old, with a few in their late 20s. They were overwhelmingly male. Their skeletons carried signs of robust health, strong muscle attachments, minimal signs of disease, only occasional markers of childhood stress. This was not a group cut down by famine or plague. It was a cohort of fighters in their prime, removed violently and suddenly. Could this have been a battlefield grave? The evidence argued against it. On battlefields, burials usually contain a mix of ages, sometimes including civilians caught in the fight, and there are often remnants of weapons or armor buried with the bodies. Here, the demographic was narrow. The injuries concentrated on heads and necks, and the deposit lacked equipment. This was not the chaos of combat. It was the order of execution. History offers a chilling context. In the late 10th and early 11th centuries, Anglo-Saxon rulers faced constant Viking raids. At times, they responded with mass reprisals. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the St. Brice's Day massacre in 1002, when King Ethelred ordered the killing of Danes across England. Whether the Oxford Pit was part of that event or another reprisal, the logic is the same: capture, restraint, execution, disposal. Still, the evidence allows for layered interpretations. Fire carried symbolic meaning, and the refusal to bury with goods could deny both honor and afterlife. Killing a group of foreign raiders in this manner may have been presented not only as justice but as ritual cleansing. The act could be both slaughter and sacrifice, a demonstration of power intended for human audiences and divine ones alike. Science can describe the cut marks and isotope ratios, and history can place the pit within a landscape of fear and vengeance. Together, they leave little doubt. These young men were taken, executed, and discarded. The pit that was meant to erase them has instead preserved their story in bone. The Oxford Pit does not stand alone. Across Europe, the Viking Age left behind many burials, yet few speak with such force. The absence of grave goods, the narrow band of age and sex, the marks of execution rather than battle, all suggest that this was not an accident of war, but an act of performance. To slaughter dozens of young men in such a way was not only to remove them as enemies, but to transform their deaths into spectacle. For the Anglo-Saxon lords who ruled England at the turn of the first millennium, the Viking raiders were more than criminals. They were a symbol of terror from the sea, a reminder of monasteries burned, villages sacked, and families stolen. By killing raiders in groups and discarding them without ceremony, rulers demonstrated to their subjects that the menace could be mastered. It is likely that these executions were witnessed. Villagers could have been called to watch, to see with their own eyes that the feared strangers were now powerless boys on their knees. The incomplete burning of the bodies may have served the same purpose. Fire marked them as impure, denying them both the dignity of a Viking pyre and the sanctity of Christian burial. The half-charred remains spoke of shame rather than honor. Forensic analysis strengthens this interpretation. The variation in tool marks on the bones suggests multiple executioners. Some cuts are clean and professional, others ragged and uncertain, as if the hand that held the blade trembled. This mixture points to several men taking turns, perhaps even ordinary townsfolk allowed to strike blows against the invaders. What had begun as terror from the sea ended in communal vengeance, transforming captives into an object lesson for all who watched. The pit thus becomes more than archaeology. It is a preserved moment of ritualized violence, where justice, revenge, and belief merged. The meaning of such an act is not confined to the Middle Ages. Centuries later, in 1943, forests near Smolensk yielded their own pits, where hundreds of Polish officers had been executed by Soviet forces. The bodies were stacked in shallow graves, hands bound, skulls pierced by bullets. Like the Vikings in Oxford, they were young men in their prime, captured and eliminated together. For decades, the truth was denied, but when forensic teams finally examined the remains, the evidence was undeniable. Just as isotope analysis and trauma studies reveal the story of the Oxford Pit, so too did ballistic evidence and DNA testing restore the story of Smolensk. In both cases, men who were supposed to disappear became enduring symbols of cruelty. The comparison is disturbing but illuminating. Across centuries and cultures, the logic of mass killing shares a grim consistency. The victims are stripped of individuality, removed from the rituals that grant dignity, and used as instruments of power. In Russia, the purpose was to decapitate a nation's future leadership. In Oxford, the purpose was to show that Viking raiders would not only die, but vanish, denied even the memory of a proper grave. Both events remind us that violence seeks to control narrative as much as, back in Oxford, the bones make clear that what was intended as humiliation has become testimony. The men died in their late teens and 20s, bound and struck down. They were dumped in a pit, their bodies burned in patches, their identities erased. Yet centuries later, their teeth tell of the fjords and fields of Scandinavia. Their bones preserve the salt of their diet, and their skulls reveal the weapons that ended them. Archaeology has made them legible again, returning names to the nameless. The question of whether this act should be called sacrifice or slaughter remains unsettled. To the Anglo-Saxons who watched, it may have felt like both. The act was political, a warning carved into flesh, but it also carried religious weight. To deny burial was to deny the soul its passage, to consign the enemy not just to death, but to exclusion from eternity. In that sense, the pit functioned as offering and punishment at once. The overlap is uncomfortable, but it fits the world of the early 11th century, when violence was a tool not only of war, but of belief. For the young men themselves, the last moments must have been filled with dread. Kneeling in a line, hearing the blows fall one by one, watching friends collapse into the earth, they would have realized that no ransom, no negotiation, no God would intervene. Each cut of steel was both punishment and theater. Each body discarded was a message. Their strength, their ambition, their seafaring skill, all reduced to silence in a single pit. Yet the silence did not last. Instead of erasure, the pit has become one of the clearest voices of the Viking Age. What was meant to be forgotten is now remembered with precision. Bones and isotopes, fractures and fire marks have preserved not only how they lived and died, but how their enemies wanted them to be seen. In the end, the pit testifies against its makers. The rulers who ordered the killing tried to control memory, but the ground has given it back. The final scene can be reconstructed from the bones. The young men were likely gathered together, perhaps bound at the wrists, perhaps stripped of the weapons that once gave them confidence. They had crossed the sea expecting silver and plunder. Instead, they faced the cold certainty of judgment. The pattern of wounds suggests that some were made to kneel, while others stood behind them with blades. An axe fell, striking true at the neck, and a head tumbled forward into the earth. Another blade was less precise, requiring 2 or 3 cuts before it found its mark. A mace swung with brutal weight, crushing cheekbones, sending fractures racing through the skull. One by one the men were dispatched, not in the chaos of a battlefield, but in a grim order that turned killing into ritual. The silence that followed would have been heavy. The villagers or soldiers who watched would have seen the bodies collapse in uneven heaps, their former terror reduced to stillness. Some executioners were practiced, others hesitant, yet together they enacted a message. This was what awaited those who brought fire from across the sea. The pit was not just a grave, but a sentence carved into the land. The disposal confirmed the intent. Bodies were dragged and cast together without separation, without markers, without care. Some were scorched, as if fire had been lit in an attempt to mar them further, to deny them the cleansing of a funeral pyre or Christian burial. Others remained untouched, leaving the impression of a half-abandoned gesture. The burning was not enough to honor or to hide, only enough to scar. The result was a heap of humanity reduced to fragments of bone and ash, meant to be swallowed by soil and forgotten. Yet the attempt at erasure failed. Radiocarbon dates placed the event in the years when England seethed with fear of Viking raids. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the St. Brice's Day massacre, an order that Danes across the kingdom be cut down. The Oxford pit may not hold those particular victims, but it carries the same logic. In times of fear, rulers used mass killing as both strategy and spectacle. They believed the act would purify their land, would display power to enemies and subjects alike. From a forensic perspective, every fracture is evidence. The clean slices at the vertebrae prove decapitation, the blunt fractures prove crushing blows, the absence of defensive wounds proves restraint. Together, these elements reconstruct not only method, but intent. These men did not die fighting. They died as captives, executed in a controlled manner. Their burial in a pit without goods was not neglect, but deliberate denial of memory. The cultural meaning deepens the horror. For Vikings, to die without ritual was to be robbed of passage to the next world. For Christians, to be denied burial was to be cast outside the community of the faithful. The killers knew this. By throwing their captives into the ground nameless and unmarked, they inflicted a second death, a spiritual one. The message was that raiders would not only lose their lives, but their identities and their futures. And yet, centuries later, the ground spoke again. Archaeologists uncovered the pit, brushed soil from bones, read the marks with modern tools. What had been intended as silence became testimony. The young men once stripped of memory now have their origins traced in enamel, their diets reconstructed in collagen, their final moments revealed by trauma. The pit has become one of the clearest windows into the brutality of the Viking Age, remembered more vividly than any monument. The climax of the story is not only the killing itself, but the inversion of intent. The executioners sought to erase. Instead, they preserved. Their blows etched a record in bones so deep that it has survived for 1,000 years. In denying these men graves, they made them unforgettable. Stand at the edge of that pit in imagination, and the echoes return. The fall of the axe, the crack of the skull, the rush of a body collapsing onto another. It is not difficult to sense the dread of those last moments, the awareness that no rescue would come, that death was both personal and political. Each man was turned into a symbol, his life extinguished for the sake of a message. The pit is quiet now, a site of study and memory, but history continues its pull forward. From these young men whose names are lost, we move to another chapter where death was shared not by dozens but by hundreds. In the medieval city of York, an entire community sought shelter from violence in a stone well. Their fate, like that of the Vikings, was recorded not in chronicles, but in bones. What waits in the depths of that well is another voice of history, haunting and unresolved. In the spring of 1190, the city of York was alive with tension. Behind its stone walls, merchants traded, monks prayed, and soldiers drilled. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythm of medieval life ran a current of fear. That year, England had been stirred by crusading fervor and by anger directed not at foreign enemies but at its own Jewish communities. Rumors spread like sparks in dry grass. Debts owed to Jewish moneylenders, resentment of outsiders, and the language of religious zeal combined into an atmosphere thick with hostility. In York, the spark became a fire. At the heart of this story stands Clifford's Tower, the great stone keep rising above the city. In March, it became the last refuge for the Jews of York, men, women, and children who fled there to escape the growing violence. Contemporary chronicles describe a mob gathering, demanding repayment of debts, calling for conversion, or worse. For the Jewish families trapped inside, the tower was both shelter and prison. With the gates locked, food scarce, and the crowd swelling outside, time itself became an enemy. The massacre that followed has been remembered in chronicles, yet archaeology has given it a new voice. In the late 20th century, work near the city uncovered a medieval well filled with human remains. The bones were jumbled, overlapping, water worn from centuries in damp stone. Among them were the skeletons of dozens of individuals, adults and children alike. The well had held not treasure, but tragedy. The discovery forced historians to confront the massacre, not only through words written by monks, but through the evidence of bone and water. The first impression was sheer number. Over 100 bones, representing at least a few dozen individuals, were recovered. Many of the skeletons were incomplete, fragmented by centuries in water. Yet, enough remained to build a picture. The demographic spread was striking. There were men and women, but also many children. Some of the youngest were no more than toddlers, their small bones delicate, their skulls barely fused. This was not the burial of a military cohort. It was a community, destroyed together. Forensic analysis offered further clues. Some bones carried cut marks, sharp incisions across vertebrae or long bones. Others showed crushing fractures, the kind produced by blunt force. Still others bore no visible wounds at all, suggesting death not by blade or club, but by drowning. The confined space of the well, narrow and dark, could have become a tomb for those who fell or were forced in alive. Water, stone, and panic can kill as surely as steel. The setting itself added weight to the story. A well is meant to preserve life, drawing water from the earth. To fill it with bodies inverted its purpose, turning a source of sustenance into a grave. The symbolism was heavy. Those cast into the well were cut off from both community and nature, denied even the earth's most basic gift. This was not a place chosen for reverence. It was a place chosen for contempt. The chronicles and the bones together paint a grim sequence. As the mob pressed around Clifford's tower, those inside saw no way out. Some may have taken their own lives to avoid capture and forced conversion. Others may have been slain when the tower was stormed. Survivors or bodies were then cast into the well, where darkness and water kept their secret for 8 centuries. The discovery in modern times reanimated the story, placing bones beside words and allowing the dead to be heard once more. The psychological dimension is unavoidable. To imagine being trapped in that tower, hearing the roar of the crowd outside, feeling the smoke of torches rising, is to imagine fear distilled. Parents clutching children, elders praying, young men deciding whether to fight or yield. All choices carried death at their end. When the final assault came, the well became the only resting place, not by choice, but by force. The echo of that fear lingers still, carried in stone and water. What stands out most is the completeness of the loss. Unlike battlefield graves or isolated killings, the York Massacre wiped out an entire community at once. These were people who had lived in the city for decades, who traded, who paid taxes, who shared its streets. In a single night they were erased. The tower that had seemed a fortress became a trap, and the well that should have sustained became a grave. The dual betrayal, of place and of neighbors, haunts the memory of York. The bones unearthed centuries later tell us what was not written in the chronicles. They show the age of the victims, the presence of children too young to speak, the reality of lives cut short together. They confirm what the text hinted and what the imagination struggles to hold, that this was not only violence, but annihilation. The discovery of the well in York provided science with the chance to examine what had long been treated as legend. Chronicles had described a massacre, but bones offered confirmation in a language beyond bias or interpretation. Forensic study began with the most basic questions. Who were these people? How did they live? And how did they die? Osteological analysis revealed a demographic cross-section consistent with an established community. There were adult men and women, but the presence of so many children was decisive. Infants barely old enough to walk, children of 5 and 7, adolescents with growth plates not yet fused. This was a population, not a raiding party or military group. The pattern aligned with historical accounts of Jewish families living in York, settled there for decades before the massacre. The bones also spoke of health and diet. Stable isotope analysis of carbon and nitrogen suggested diets that differed from the surrounding Christian population. Lower nitrogen values reflected reduced consumption of animal protein, consistent with Jewish dietary practice. Collagen samples told of steady nourishment, with no widespread evidence of famine or malnutrition. These were not desperate wanderers, but established townspeople, part of the city's fabric. The story of their deaths came next. Several skulls bore evidence of sharp force trauma, deep cuts along the cranium, likely from swords or axes. Other bones showed crushing injuries inflicted by heavy blows. Yet many skeletons carried no marks at all. The absence of trauma suggested death by suffocation or drowning. In the confines of a well, panic alone can kill, as bodies press against one another in the scramble for air. Children in particular would have been vulnerable, overwhelmed not by steel but by the terror of the crush. The placement of the remains offered further insight. Bodies were jumbled, not carefully arranged. Some lay face down, others on their sides. The commingling suggested that individuals were cast in quickly, with little regard. The water of the well preserved them in a state of confusion, evidence of the speed and violence of their disposal. Unlike ordered graves, where bodies are aligned and possessions placed, this was a sight of contempt. The timing of the massacre is preserved in documents as March 1190. The political climate in England then was volatile. King Richard had only recently been crowned, and his reign was bound up with the rhetoric of Crusade. Across the realm, Jewish communities suffered attacks fueled by religious zeal and economic resentment. At York, the local gentry owed heavy debts to Jewish moneylenders. To erase the creditors was to erase the debts. The mob outside Clifford's tower, then, was not only driven by faith, but by finance. Inside the tower, the families faced impossible choices. Chroniclers describe how some leaders of the community urged collective suicide rather than forced baptism. Others resisted. In the end, chaos decided. Fires were set, the tower breached, and those who did not die by their own hands were taken by the crowd. For the survivors, the well was the final destination. Whether thrown alive or after death, they were discarded like refuse. Archaeology anchors this story. Radiocarbon dating placed the bones firmly in the late 12th century, aligning with the events of 1190. The isotopes confirmed they were not foreigners passing through, but locals who had lived in England for generations. The distribution of ages matched a civilian population. The mixture of injuries and drowning confirmed a violent, chaotic death. The evidence and the chronicles converge. This was a massacre of York's Jews, carried out under the gaze of neighbors and recorded by both pen and bone. The psychological weight of the evidence is heavy. To examine the small bones of a child who died in the darkness of a well is to face more than data. It is to confront fear at its most intimate, when families realized they were trapped, when fathers could not protect, when mothers clutched infants with nowhere to flee. Each fracture, each drowned skeleton, each isotope value is a whisper from that night, echoing across centuries. The massacre at York was not unique in medieval Europe. Pogroms swept across communities from England to Germany in the wake of crusading fervor. Yet the well in York is unique in how it preserves the event not only in text, but in matter. It is a site where hatred and fear were poured into stone and water, preserved until modern science retrieved them. The victims have no individual names, but collectively they carry the story of a community erased in a single night. What the bones reveal is more than violence. They reveal intention. The killers chose the well not for reverence, but for humiliation. To turn a source of life into a grave was to invert its meaning, to ensure that even in death the victims would be denied dignity. That intention has failed. Instead, the well has become a monument, a place where absence speaks and silence testifies. The story of York does not exist in isolation. Across medieval Europe, violence against Jewish communities flared repeatedly, especially during moments of political strain or religious fervor. The massacre at Clifford's Tower was one of the most infamous in England, but it was part of a broader pattern. What makes York unique is that its memory is preserved not only in chronicles written by monks, but also in the bones recovered from the well. Most pogroms left only words, often hostile or distorted. York left voices in stone and water. The presence of children in the pit sharpens the tragedy. Archaeologists found tiny vertebrae, fragile ribs, skulls barely fused. These were the smallest victims, carried into the tower by parents desperate for refuge. Their deaths underscore the fact that this was not a clash of warriors, but the destruction of families. The idea of parents facing such choices, whether to surrender, resist, or end their own lives, is a reminder that history is not abstract. It is lived in moments of terror and loss. There is a chilling echo in another place and another time. In 1349, during the Black Death, rumors swept through Europe accusing Jews of poisoning wells. In Strasbourg, hundreds of Jews were rounded up and burned alive by their neighbors. In Basel, entire communities were driven onto islands in the Rhine and executed. The logic was the same as York. Outsiders made responsible for crisis, wealth resented, difference magnified into threat. The wells of Strasbourg and Basel, once symbols of life, became symbols of imagined betrayal. In York, a well became the literal grave of those accused. The repetition across centuries reveals a pattern that transcends local events. Fear, prejudice, and greed can combine into an engine of destruction, targeting those least able to resist. Back in York, the bones in the well tell us more than chronicles ever could. Some of the adult skeletons carried stress markers that suggest physical labor, evidence that these people worked in crafts and trades. Others had dental health that reflected access to reasonable diets, showing they were not destitute but established. Isotope signatures confirmed that many had grown up locally, children of parents already settled in England. They were not foreign invaders. They were neighbors. The decision to drive them into the tower, and then into the well, therefore carried an additional betrayal. These were not strangers who arrived with weapons. They were townspeople who had lived alongside their killers for years. Their deaths cannot be explained only by crusading zeal. They were also the result of debts owed, rivalries nursed, resentments cultivated. The massacre at York was as much about economics and envy as about faith. The chroniclers noted that records of debts held by Jewish families were destroyed in the flames. Killing the lenders erased not only lives but obligations. The physical evidence reinforces the idea of chaos rather than orderly slaughter. Some individuals died from blows, others from drowning, others perhaps from smoke inhalation when fires were set against the tower. The bones recovered from the well preserve this variety of death. Sharp cuts on vertebrae, crushing blows to skulls, and skeletons without trauma all lie together, telling a story of confusion and desperation. In the narrow shaft, bodies fell upon one another. Panic would have spread faster than fire. Breathing would have been impossible. The sound of water below and screams above would have merged into darkness. This is the power of archaeology, to bring back the sensory truth of the past. Documents speak of betrayal and siege. Bones speak of individuals, their ages, their health, their final moments. Combined, they make the York Massacre one of the most vividly documented pogroms of the Middle Ages. It is no longer only an entry in a chronicle. It is a human event preserved in both memory and matter. The resonance of the story reaches beyond York. The comparison with later massacres in Strasbourg and Basel shows how fear and hatred recur. The well at York becomes part of a larger pattern, where water and fire, two elements meant to sustain, are twisted into tools of destruction. The lives ended there are part of a long history of communities marked for death by the same combination of prejudice and opportunism. To stand today in York, within sight of Clifford's tower, is to sense this layering of history. The stone keep has been rebuilt. Tourists climb its steps. Children run across the grass. Yet, beneath the surface lies the memory of those who perished. The well is no longer open. The bones have been studied and reburied, but their story remains. It is a reminder that violence against neighbors can emerge not from distant wars, but from within a community itself. The bones do not accuse individuals by name. They accuse a pattern of fear turned into action, of difference magnified into death. The echo of their story is not confined to medieval England. It speaks wherever neighbors turn upon neighbors, wherever the places of safety become places of final refuge. The final moments inside Clifford's tower can only be imagined, yet the bones and chronicles together give shape to the silence. The mob outside had grown restless. Torches flared against stone walls, voices shouted demands, and the night echoed with anger sharpened by debt and zeal. Within, the Jewish families huddled in desperation. Fathers debated, mothers prayed, children cried, and the air grew thick with smoke from fires set at the gates. In those cramped chambers, the awareness would have come slowly at first, and then with crushing certainty. No help would arrive, no bargain would be honored. Some chose death by their own hand, rather than capture. Chronicles describe how fathers cut their children's throats, how husbands and wives struck one another down before setting fire to their belongings. Others resisted such counsel, clinging to the chance of mercy. For them, the storming of the tower ended hope. The mob broke through, weapons flashing in torchlight, and in the chaos screams rose and fell. Those not killed outright were driven or dragged toward the well. Water that had once sustained the city now swallowed its people. Bodies fell into darkness, piling upon one another, the living smothered beneath the dead. In the narrow shaft, the line between drowning and crushing vanished. Breath failed, and the city's silence was sealed in stone and water. The archaeological record supports this grim sequence. Some skeletons bore sharp cuts, confirming the swords of attackers. Others carried blunt force injuries, the marks of clubs or stones. Yet many had no signs of trauma, their lives ended by suffocation or drowning. The mixture tells us that the massacre did not follow a single pattern. It was a frenzy of killing, some deliberate, some chaotic, but all leading to the same pit. What the chronicles emphasize is the destruction of memory. Once the tower was taken and the well filled, records of debts owed to the Jewish community were burned. Violence served two masters, hatred and convenience. By erasing the lenders, their neighbors freed themselves of obligation. By erasing the people, they claimed the mantle of piety. In one night, York was cleansed of its Jews, and for centuries the city carried that stain quietly beneath its stones. From a cultural perspective, the well itself was part of the crime. To be denied burial in consecrated ground was to be denied dignity and the promise of afterlife. To be cast into water was to be erased. The mob chose not only to kill, but to condemn. Yet time has twisted the meaning. Instead of silence, the well has become a monument. The discovery of the bones gave the victims back their voices, reminding the city that what was intended as erasure is now testimony. Standing before Clifford's tower today, tourists see a castle, perhaps a landmark in a guidebook. Few realize that beneath lies the memory of an entire community undone in a single night. The well is no longer open, but the story flows from it still, carried by bone and archive. To speak of York is to speak of betrayal, of fear weaponized, of neighbors who turned into executioners. The tower was fortress and trap, the well a grave dug not by nature but by human choice. The climax of this story is not simply the massacre itself, but the inversion of intent. Those who killed sought to erase memory, yet they created one of the most enduring records of medieval intolerance. The bones have spoken with greater clarity than the words of the crowd ever could. The victims live on in testimony, while the fury of their killers is reduced to echoes. The chapter of York closes not with peace, but with a question. If such violence could rise within the walls of a city against its own residents, what does that say about the fragility of belonging? If neighbors can turn so quickly into enemies, what certainty can any community claim? The well is silent, but its silence is a question that lingers. And as the torchlight fades from Clifford's tower, we turn to the next shadowed chapter, where violence and faith collide again, not in a tower or a well, but across the fields of Europe, where heresy itself became a target and crusades were turned inward. In the summer of 1209, the city of Béziers in southern France awoke to the sound of armies gathering beyond its walls. Thousands of crusaders had marched not east toward the Holy Land, but south, into the lands of their own continent. The Pope had called for war not against Muslims or pagans, but against fellow Christians, the Cathars of Languedoc, whose beliefs challenged the authority of Rome. What followed was one of the darkest chapters of medieval Europe, a war where faith turned against faith, and where massacre and fire became sermons in stone and ash. The Cathars, sometimes called Albigensians after the town of Albi, rejected the wealth and hierarchy of the Catholic Church. They taught a dualist theology, believing that the world of matter was corrupt, created by an evil force, and that the true divine was found only in spirit. To Rome, this was heresy of the deepest kind, undermining both doctrine and power. To the lords of Languedoc, however, Catharism had found fertile ground. The faith spread, and with it came networks of protection and patronage. It was a movement embedded in society, not a small sect on the margins. The Pope's response was unprecedented. In 1208, after the murder of a papal legate, Innocent III called for a crusade against the Cathars. Nobles of northern France and beyond were promised indulgences as if they had gone to Jerusalem. To fight heretics at home became equal to fighting infidels abroad. Armies gathered bearing crosses on their tunics, chanting hymns and carrying banners of Christ. But their swords were not turned outward. They were turned inward, against neighbors who spoke the same language, tilled the same fields, and prayed in churches that looked little different. Béziers was the first target. It was a city of perhaps 15,000, mixed in faith and allegiance. Catholics and Cathars lived side by side, bound by trade and blood. When the crusading army demanded the surrender of the heretics, the townspeople refused. The gates stayed shut, and in that decision, fate was sealed. On July 22nd, the Crusaders stormed the walls. The chroniclers record what followed, in words that still burn. Soldiers asked their abbot how they might distinguish heretics from faithful Catholics within the city. The reply, apocryphal or not, became infamous. "Kill them all. God will know his own." The slaughter that followed was swift and merciless. Thousands were cut down in the streets, their bodies left where they fell. The church of St. Mary Magdalene, where townspeople had sought sanctuary, became a trap. Soldiers set it aflame, and those who had crowded within perished in the smoke and fire. The city itself was burned, its stones blackened, its voices silenced. By nightfall, Béziers was little more than a ruin, its people erased in the name of purity. Archaeological evidence from the region bears out the violence. Excavations near Béziers have revealed layers of burning consistent with widespread fire in the early 13th century. Charred timbers, collapsed masonry, and human remains found in communal pits all align with the descriptions of massacre. The bones tell their own truths: skulls with sword cuts, ribs pierced by arrows, pelvises fractured by crushing blows. Some skeletons show perimortem burning, the charring that comes when flesh still clings to bone as fire consumes it. These are not the traces of an accidental blaze, but of deliberate destruction. The siege of Béziers set the tone for the Albigensian Crusade. It was not simply a war of theology, but a campaign of terror designed to extinguish a community. The Crusaders marched from town to town, demanding submission, offering conversion, and when refused, unleashing fire and steel. The Cathars, who sought purity of spirit, found their bodies broken and their homes destroyed. The campaign was as much about politics as faith, for the northern French nobles who joined the crusade also coveted the rich lands of Languedoc. Behind the hymns lay ambition. Behind the indulgences lay power. The massacre at Béziers remains a symbol of how quickly neighbors can become executioners when fear and authority align. It was not fought on distant fields, but in the streets of a European city under the gaze of cathedrals and towers built by the same hands that now lay dead. The irony of a crusade turned inward was sharp. The church that preached universal salvation had sanctioned universal slaughter. What happened at Béziers was the opening act of a 20-year campaign. It was the moment when the idea of holy war, once aimed at distant lands, was turned inward upon Europe itself. In the flames of that city, the principle was established. Heresy could be met not with argument, but with annihilation. The well in York had silenced a community with water and stone. Béziers silenced another with fire and sword. The pattern of violence widened, crossing not only borders, but the boundaries of faith itself. The fall of Béziers was only the beginning. In the months that followed, the crusading army pressed deeper into Languedoc. Each town was confronted with the same demand: surrender the heretics or face destruction. The city of Carcassonne resisted briefly, but its walls could not withstand the pressure of the siege. When the gates finally opened, the citizens were expelled, stripped of possessions, and sent wandering. Their lord, Raymond Roger Trencavel, was captured and died soon after in captivity. For the Crusaders, Carcassonne became not only a victory, but a foothold, a base from which to extend control. For the people of Languedoc, it was a warning that no refuge would last. The Albigensian Crusade was fought not only with armies but with hunger and fear. Siege warfare dominated the campaign. Castles and walled towns dotted the landscape, each a stronghold for Cathars and their allies. To break them, the Crusaders used a combination of blockade and terror. Supplies were cut off, wells poisoned, and fields burned. Archaeological surveys of sites in the region show layers of destruction that correspond to these sieges. Burnt grain stores, collapsed fortifications, arrowheads scattered in soil. The very earth still holds fragments of that struggle. Montségur, perched high in the Pyrenees, became the most enduring symbol of Cathar resistance. The castle's steep cliffs made it nearly impregnable, and for years it served as refuge for Cathar believers and leaders. From there they preached, sheltered, and defied. The Crusaders could not ignore it. In 1243, decades after the beginning of the Crusade, a massive army surrounded Montségur. For 10 months the defenders held out, supplied by hidden paths and the determination of faith. In March of 1244, the fortress finally fell. The fate of those within was sealed. Contemporary accounts describe how more than 200 Cathars refused to recant their beliefs. They were marched down from the mountain and into a field at its base. There, a great pyre was built. One by one, families stepped forward into the flames, chanting prayers as the fire consumed them. Archaeological evidence supports this grim scene. Excavations at the site have revealed layers of ash and charcoal, consistent with a massive conflagration in the mid-13th century. Fragments of bone, warped and blackened, confirm that human bodies were among the fuel. The field is still known today as the Prat des Cramats, the field of the burned. Forensic anthropology adds detail to the story. Analysis of bones from mass graves in Languedoc shows perimortem trauma, sword cuts to skulls, defensive wounds on forearms, fractures from crushing blows. Others show evidence of starvation and malnutrition, especially in children, consistent with long sieges where food supplies were severed. These details remind us that the Crusade was not only a series of battles, but a campaign that starved and exhausted entire communities before finishing them with fire or steel. The Crusade was also a war of memory. The Catholic Church sought to eliminate not only the bodies of heretics but their teachings. Manuscripts were seized and burned. Preachers were silenced. Those who survived the sieges were forced to convert or face death. Yet archaeology resists this erasure. Traces of Cathar settlements, ritual spaces, and symbols survive in hidden places. Inscriptions carved into walls, fragments of religious texts, and the ruins of fortresses speak across the centuries, refusing complete silence. What emerges is a picture of systematic annihilation. The Crusade was not a clash of equal armies, but an overwhelming assault by forces sanctioned by Rome and motivated by both faith and ambition. The nobles of northern France gained land and power. The papacy demonstrated authority. The victims were the people of Languedoc, whose towns were emptied, whose castles were ruined, whose bones still carry the evidence of starvation and massacre. The forensic record from sites like Béziers and Montségur aligns with the chronicles yet adds layers of truth. Cut marks on vertebrae confirm executions. Burned bone fragments confirm pyres. Signs of malnutrition confirm the grinding pressure of siege. These are the details that turn history into lived reality. They remind us that the Crusade was not fought only in theology, but in hunger, fire, and fear. The Albigensian Crusade thus stands as a moment when holy war turned inward, when Europe devoured its own in the name of purity. The victims were not distant strangers, but neighbors who spoke the same language and shared the same soil. The bones that remain show how thoroughly power can mark the body and how thoroughly belief can justify its destruction. The Albigensian Crusade did more than destroy cities and castles. It introduced a new model of repression, one that would echo through European history long after the fires of Languedoc burned out. The memory of Béziers and Montségur was not confined to the 13th century. The idea that faith could justify extermination, that purity could be enforced through violence, returned again and again in different forms. To understand the depth of this change, one must see how war turned into ritual. At Montségur, the burning of 200 believers was not only punishment, but demonstration. The crowd gathered, the pyre built, and the victims themselves walked into the flames singing hymns. The act was staged as a lesson. Heresy was not only to be rejected, but to be obliterated. Archaeology bears witness to this message in the layers of ash and charred bone still lying in the soil. Each fragment is both evidence of death and evidence of performance, of a moment designed to show the power of the Church and the futility of resistance. Centuries later, in the 16th and 17th centuries, Europe was once again torn apart by wars of religion. The Protestant Reformation fractured Christendom, and Catholic and Protestant states turned their armies upon one another. The 30 Years' War devastated Central Europe, leaving villages emptied, fields barren, and mass graves scattered across the land. In some towns, half the population perished. The methods were different, but the logic was the same. Purity defended by fire and sword, neighbors divided by belief. Archaeological surveys in Germany and the Low Countries have uncovered mass burials from that era, skeletons jumbled like those of Béziers, their bones marked by blades and bullets rather than axes and maces. The echo of Languedoc resounded across centuries. Back in southern France, the psychological toll of the Crusade was immense. Survivors were forced into silence. Some converted under threat, outwardly conforming while inwardly mourning the loss of their community. Others fled into mountains or across borders. The Cathar faith, once widespread, dwindled. Its last defenders were remembered not as citizens but as martyrs, their names preserved only in whispers and fragments. Yet their absence shaped the region. The rich culture of Occitan language and tradition was suppressed, replaced by the authority of northern lords and the Catholic hierarchy. What had been a land of diversity became a land of conformity, reshaped by blood. The bones and ruins that remain give us glimpses of individual lives. In Béziers, fragments of children's skeletons remind us that the victims were families, not soldiers. In Montségur, the ash of the pyre contains traces of men and women who chose to burn rather than betray their faith. In smaller villages, collapsed walls and burned grain stores testify to the hunger imposed by siege. Each piece of evidence carries the weight of human decision. Armies chose to cut off food, to light torches, to drive captives into fire. None of it was inevitable. All of it was chosen. The comparative story of York, Béziers, Montségur, and later Europe demonstrates a grim continuity. Communities marked as other, whether for faith, ethnicity, or belief, became targets of annihilation. Wells became graves, towers became traps, castles became pyres, and fields became killing grounds. Archaeology allows us to trace this continuity not only in chronicles but in soil, bone, and ash. The scientific precision of isotopes and trauma analysis confirms what human memory sometimes denies, that the pursuit of purity often produces only ruin. For the people of Languedoc, the Crusade ended not only lives but an entire cultural landscape. The troubadours who had sung in Occitan courts fell silent. The castles that had symbolized local power became ruins under northern control. The Cathar belief itself disappeared, remembered only in accusations of heresy and in the haunting stories of martyrdom. Yet the bones speak otherwise. They remind us that this was not abstract theology, but lived reality, where men and women, children and elders, met their deaths under the banners of those who claimed to fight for God. The Albigensian Crusade thus occupies a turning point. It was a rehearsal for the age of Inquisition and for the later wars of religion that would scar Europe. It showed how organized faith, when fused with politics, could unleash violence of a scale usually reserved for foreign wars. And it showed how easily a community could be marked for erasure, its memory intended to vanish but instead preserved in the ground. Today, to walk the ruins of Montségur or the streets of Béziers is to sense the presence of absence. The stones are quiet, the fire's long gone, but the silence is heavy. The ground remembers. The people who once lived there left behind not only ruins but the echo of their songs, their prayers, and their screams. In that echo we find the meaning of the Crusade. Faith turned against faith, community turned against itself, humanity lost to the hunger for purity. The siege of Montségur ended with fire, and that fire has never gone out in memory. Contemporary accounts describe how more than 200 Cathars were led from the fortress after its surrender in March 1244. They were offered a final chance to renounce their faith. None did. Families walked together down the steep mountain path into the valley below, where a pyre had been built. The air was heavy with the scent of resinous wood. As the crowd gathered, the condemned sang hymns, their voices rising above the crackle of flames. Then, one by one, they stepped into the fire. Archaeological traces confirm the scale of the burning. Soil analysis at the site has revealed layers of charcoal and ash deposited in a single episode. Fragments of bone warped by intense heat testify that human bodies were consumed. The evidence matches the chronicles. This was no small execution, but a mass immolation that turned an open field into a furnace. The pyre at Montségur was meant to erase a faith, to cauterize it from the land, yet in its very violence, it preserved memory. The place became known as the Field of the Burned, a name that carries the echo of flames even 8 centuries later. The forensic study of bones from other sites in Languedoc fills out the picture. At Béziers, skeletons from communal pits bear sword cuts to skulls, arrowheads lodged in ribs, and fractures from crushing blows. Some show perimortem burning, the blackening that comes when flesh still covers bone. At smaller castles, children's remains reveal lines of arrested growth, evidence of starvation during sieges. Others carry healed fractures, signs of lives once lived in conflict long before the Crusade arrived. These details remind us that the victims were not faceless heretics but individuals, their lives etched into bone as clearly as their deaths. The campaign of fire and steel reshaped the landscape of Languedoc. Castles were toppled, villages emptied, manuscripts destroyed. The Cathar faith was extinguished, but the method of its destruction endured. The idea that heresy could be crushed by violence became institutionalized. The Inquisition, born in the wake of the Crusade, carried the logic forward. Records of interrogations, confessions, and executions stretched across Europe, a bureaucratic echo of the flames at Montségur. Yet the attempt to silence has failed. Archaeology and memory have conspired to keep the voices alive. In the soil of Béziers and Montségur, the charred bones and collapsed stones still whisper of fire. In the Occitan songs that survived in fragments, echoes of a lost culture remain. In the chronicles of both supporters and critics, the contradictions of faith and violence are laid bare. The Crusade ended Catharism, but it also left behind a testimony of what happens when belief becomes a weapon. The climax of the story is not only the fire itself, but the inversion of meaning it produced. To the Crusaders, the pyre was a triumph, proof of orthodoxy defended. To the victims, it was martyrdom, proof of faith unbroken. To us, centuries later, it is a warning carved into bone and ash. The same act carries 3 truths, each carried by those who witnessed, suffered, and remember. Standing at Montségur today, the mountain seems quiet, the air filled with the cry of birds rather than hymns, yet the silence is deceptive. Beneath the grass lies a layer of charcoal. Beneath the ruins lies the weight of memory. The field where fire once consumed has become a site of pilgrimage, a place where absence is as tangible as stone. As the smoke of Montségur fades into history, a question remains. How far will power go to preserve itself in the name of belief? How many more times would Europe turn inward, setting torch to its own villages, spilling the blood of its own people? The crusade against the Cathars was not the last. From Montségur we move forward to other moments when violence cloaked itself in holiness, when the sword was lifted not against strangers, but against neighbors, and when memory itself became a battlefield. In the middle of the 14th century, Europe awoke to a silence more terrible than war. Bells tolled in villages where half the population had already vanished. Streets lay empty and fields untended. Rats moved freely across abandoned barns, and fleas carried death from host to host. The Black Death, as it would later be called, had arrived, and no city, castle, or monastery would escape its reach. Unlike the clash of armies, this enemy had no banners and no face, yet its power exceeded that of any crusading host. The disease struck with a swiftness that defied comprehension. A man who felt healthy at sunrise could be fevered by midday, his skin darkening with swellings in the groin or armpit, his breath sour, his strength gone. Within days, sometimes within hours, he was dead. Families collapsed in sequence, parents and children alike succumbing. Burial could not keep pace with death. Bodies piled in streets, carts creaked under their weight, and pits were dug hastily to swallow dozens at once. Chroniclers wrote with stunned disbelief, comparing the plague to divine punishment, a judgment upon the world. The origins of the pestilence lay far beyond Europe's borders. Modern science has traced its cause to the bacterium Yersinia pestis, carried in the fleas that infested black rats, Archaeological work has uncovered its traces in DNA extracted from teeth of victims buried in plague pits. These tiny fragments of genetic material confirm that the same disease that struck Europe in 1347 had roots in Asia, moving along the trade routes of the Silk Road, spreading westward with caravans and ships. Genoese merchants, fleeing a siege in Crimea where the disease first struck, carried it by sea to Sicily. From there it raced northward, across Italy, France, England, Germany, and beyond. The demographic impact was catastrophic. In less than a decade, perhaps 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population had perished. Entire villages were erased, their names remembered only in abandoned fields and broken stones. Cities fared no better. London lost tens of thousands, Florence perhaps half its citizens, Paris the same. The death rate was not uniform. Some communities escaped with minimal losses, while others vanished entirely. Yet the fear was universal. Each cough, each fever, each unexplained swelling was read as a sentence of death. The archaeology of plague pits makes this scale visible. In London's East Smithfield Cemetery, excavated in the 1980s, rows of bodies were found stacked in long trenches. They were laid side by side without coffins, sometimes with layers of lime poured over them in an attempt at sanitation. The sheer number revealed that the normal rhythms of burial had collapsed. Priests could not recite prayers over every grave. Families could not mourn each death. The plague overwhelmed not only bodies but rituals, leaving communities spiritually as well as physically broken. The terror of the plague was sharpened by ignorance. Medieval medicine had no concept of bacteria or fleas. Physicians debated whether the cause lay in bad air, planetary alignment, or the wrath of God. Some advised avoiding baths, fearing that open pores invited infection. Others recommended flagellation, the scourging of one's own flesh to appease divine anger. In towns across Germany, processions of flagellants marched barefoot, whipping themselves until blood ran, their cries echoing through streets already filled with mourning. Archaeological evidence of their passage survives in murals and inscriptions, where painted figures of the dance of death remind us of the obsession with mortality. Fear also sought scapegoats. Rumors spread that Jews had poisoned wells, and pogroms erupted across Europe. In Strasbourg, Basel, and countless smaller towns, Jewish communities were massacred by their neighbors. The logic of the mob was the same as in York centuries earlier. In times of fear, difference became guilt. Mass graves from these persecutions mingle with those of plague victims, intertwining violence with disease in the soil of medieval Europe. What distinguishes the Black Death from earlier calamities is the combination of scale and speed. Wars had killed thousands, famines tens of thousands, but the plague felled millions in a span so short that generations were marked. The survivors carried scars not only of loss but of a changed world. Labor became scarce, wages rose, authority weakened, and faith itself was shaken. The bells that tolled over empty streets announced not only death but transformation. In the silence that followed, questions multiplied. Was this punishment for sin or a test of endurance? Was it random chance or divine will? The bodies in the pits could not answer, but centuries later, science has begun to speak. Ancient DNA confirms the culprit, isotope studies show the malnutrition that accompanied the crisis, and archaeology reveals the haste of burials. Together they restore clarity to what the chroniclers recorded in fear. The plague was not mystery alone. It was biology, carried in blood and breath, yet magnified by ignorance and despair. The plague pits of Europe hold more than bones. They hold evidence of how societies collapsed under the weight of mortality. Excavations in London's East Smithfield Cemetery provide one of the clearest windows. The cemetery was established specifically for plague victims between 1348 and 1350, during the height of the epidemic in England. Archaeologists uncovered long trenches where bodies were stacked in orderly rows, head to toe, layer upon layer. In some trenches, more than 50 individuals lay together, covered quickly with soil and lime. The arrangement shows both desperation and method. The dead were too numerous for coffins or ceremonies, yet officials still sought order, a grim attempt to impose dignity where chaos reigned. Forensic analysis of these remains has transformed our understanding of the Black Death. By drilling into teeth and extracting pulp, scientists recovered fragments of ancient DNA. In those fragments lay the signature of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that caused plague. This discovery, confirmed in sites across Europe, ended centuries of debate about what had killed so many. The skeletal remains carried the answer in silence, waiting for modern tools to unlock it. Osteological study revealed details beyond cause of death. Many skeletons showed signs of chronic stress, enamel defects from childhood malnutrition, stunted growth in long bones, and arthritis from hard labor. These indicators remind us that plague struck populations already strained by poor harvests and inequality. The disease did not fall upon a healthy society, but upon one weakened by famine and conflict. In that weakness, mortality soared. The trauma of mass death reshaped burial practices. Normally, medieval cemeteries placed individuals with care, accompanied by prayers and rites. The plague pits broke those customs. Whole families were interred together, sometimes children nestled against adults, suggesting they died within days of one another. Archaeologists found rosary beads, crosses, and small tokens hastily buried with some victims, perhaps placed by survivors who wanted to preserve fragments of ritual even in haste. Yet in many cases, there was nothing but earth and bone, the speed of death erasing tradition. Elsewhere in Europe, the picture was the same. In Florence, mass graves filled the outskirts of the city. In Lübeck and other German towns, hastily dug pits swallowed entire neighborhoods. Excavations in Marseille revealed bodies stacked in abandoned wells, echoing the horrors of York centuries earlier. Everywhere, the message was the same. The plague overwhelmed the ability of communities to manage death. Archaeology preserves the evidence of that collapse in the layers of soil and bone. The fear of contagion changed daily life. People abandoned sick relatives, deserted villages, and fled cities. Chronicles describe carts moving through streets, collecting corpses like refuse. Doors were marked with painted signs to warn of infection. In some towns, laws were passed forbidding the ringing of bells at funerals, as the sound itself spread panic. The physical evidence of these measures survives in documents and in altered landscapes, abandoned houses, deserted fields, and sudden breaks in parish registers. The search for explanation and control often turned against minorities. Jewish communities were accused of poisoning wells, and pogroms erupted across Germany and Switzerland. In Strasbourg, hundreds were burned alive in February 1349, months before the plague even reached the city. Archaeology has recovered the remains of some of these massacres, mass burials where trauma marks bones not of disease but of violence. The link between pestilence and persecution is written in both soil and record. Fear did not only kill by infection, it killed by rumor and rage. Science continues to uncover the biological details of the epidemic. Ancient DNA studies show that the strain of Yersinia pestis, responsible for the Black Death, was the ancestor of later outbreaks, including those in the 17th century and even the smaller flare-ups of plague that persisted into the 20th. Isotope analysis of plague victims reveals diets low in protein, suggesting vulnerability. Bone chemistry shows lives lived on the edge, where famine left people more susceptible to disease. The plague was not only a bacterium, it was a catastrophe shaped by the conditions of medieval life. The social consequences were immense. Labor shortages gave survivors new bargaining power, altering the structure of feudal society. In England, wages rose, serfs demanded freedom, and the foundations of old hierarchies cracked. The plague reshaped not only demography but politics and economy. The evidence of these shifts lies in written law codes, but also in archaeology, deserted villages, new patterns of land use, and the sudden rise of smaller homesteads replacing manorial estates. What unites all this evidence is the reminder that the Black Death was both biological and human. The bacterium killed swiftly, but human responses shaped its course. Panic drove families to abandon their own, hatred drove mobs to massacre neighbors, and ignorance drove processions of flagellants to scourge their flesh in the hope of mercy. The bones unearthed in East Smithfield and beyond record not only the deaths, but the society that surrounded them. They tell us of hunger, of labor, of inequality, and of rituals fractured by fear. The plague pits, silent for centuries, now testify that the 14th century was an age of endings. Yet within those endings were seeds of transformation. The collapse of population created opportunities for survivors. Fields once abandoned became newly fertile. Vacant houses were taken by new tenants. Authority struggled to control a society suddenly less bound by tradition. The catastrophe was also a turning point, though one paid for with immeasurable suffering. The Black Death was not only an event of numbers and graves, it was an event of imagination. In paintings, manuscripts, and carvings, death was personified as never before. Skeletons danced with kings and peasants alike, reminding all that rank and wealth could not shield against plague. This imagery, known as the Dance of Death, spread across Europe in the decades after the epidemic. Archaeology has revealed murals painted in churches and cloisters, their figures stark and unsettling. They testify to a world where mortality was no longer distant but constant, where every cough and swelling could be the first step in a final dance. The plague also reshaped the rhythms of faith. In towns across Germany and the Low Countries, groups of flagellants marched barefoot through the streets, whipping themselves until blood ran down their backs. Their songs and cries were both prayer and protest, calling on God to end the pestilence. Archaeological traces of their presence remain in graffiti, inscriptions, and depictions etched on walls. Yet their movement was soon suppressed by church authorities, who feared that this uncontrolled fervor was itself a form of heresy. The Black Death created both devotion and disorder, and the struggle to contain both was part of its legacy. To grasp the broader significance of plague, it helps to see it in the context of later pandemics. In 1918, influenza swept across the globe, killing tens of millions in a matter of months. The Spanish flu, as it was called, spread with a speed that echoed the plague of the 14th century. Soldiers returning from the trenches of the First World War carried it across oceans, just as merchants and sailors had carried plague centuries earlier. Hospitals overflowed, coffins ran short, and communities faced the same terror of invisible contagion. Archaeological and medical records from 1918 show mass graves dug in haste, eerily similar to those of East Smithfield. The common thread across centuries is the way disease overwhelms social systems, forcing societies into crisis and stripping away the illusions of control. The comparison also highlights the human search for explanation. In 1348, people blamed Jews, foreigners, or poisoned air. In 1918, rumors spread that German spies had released the flu as a weapon. Both pandemics generated fear that looked for scapegoats, turning neighbors into enemies. The archaeology of mass graves in Strasbourg and Basel, where Jewish victims of pogroms were buried, mirrors the cemeteries of 1918, where influenza victims were laid in rows. Though the causes differed, the pattern of fear and exclusion repeated. Back in the 14th century, the everyday fabric of life changed beyond recognition. Markets emptied, schools closed, and fields lay fallow. Archaeological studies of deserted villages in England reveal how entire communities vanished. Roof beams collapsed, hearths went cold, and the land slowly reclaimed its houses. In some regions, the soil still bears the outlines of medieval fields abandoned during the plague years. These ghost villages are landscapes of absence, their silence another record of mortality. The bones themselves preserve the personal side of the catastrophe. In East Smithfield, one trench contained a young woman and a child laid together, perhaps mother and son, perhaps siblings. No coffin, no marker, only the gesture of proximity. In another grave, a rosary lay beside skeletal hands, a token placed in haste yet with care. Such details remind us that even when death arrived in overwhelming numbers, love and ritual persisted in fragments. The plague erased much, but not everything. The psychological impact may be measured in art and literature as much as in bone. Writers of the time described a world unmoored. Boccaccio's Decameron, written in the aftermath, opens with young Florentines fleeing the city to escape contagion. Their tales are filled with laughter and desire, but beneath them lies the fear of a world collapsing. Archaeological evidence complements this literary voice. The very ruins of plague pits, the deserted homes, The half-built churches abandoned when funds and laborers disappeared all bear witness to a society stunned into silence. The Black Death became a defining memory, not just of mortality, but of fragility. It taught survivors that life could be undone in weeks, that authority could fail, that neighbors could turn violent, and that certainty was an illusion. The parallel to later pandemics reminds us that such lessons are never fully learned. Each time, fear drives explanation, and explanation drives action, sometimes compassionate, often destructive. The evidence lies in graves old and new, in bones that whisper across centuries that disease is as much a story of humanity as it is of biology. In the end, the Black Death was both a tragedy and a teacher. Its lessons echo in murals, in ruins, in DNA sequences, and in stories carried across time. It remains one of the greatest reminders that beneath all structures of power and belief, human bodies are fragile, and human fear even more so. The Black Death did not arrive in a single wave and then depart. It struck again and again, returning in cycles that stretched across generations. Each resurgence reawakened dread, for survivors knew the signs and knew how quickly life could unravel. Chroniclers describe towns where bells tolled endlessly, where the smell of lime from open pits clung to the air, and where survivors lived as though waiting their turn. Archaeology confirms this recurrence. Later plague cemeteries in London, Lubeck, and Barcelona show multiple layers of burial, each aligned with fresh outbreaks in the 14th and 15th centuries. The pits became layered chronicles of despair, each trench a reminder that the disease was not finished. The experience of those who lived through the first outbreak shaped how people met the later ones. In some towns, officials imposed quarantines, closing city gates, halting trade, and confining the sick to their homes. Archaeological evidence of these measures survives in abandoned goods and sealed houses where belongings were left behind and never reclaimed. In other places, the response was resignation, a sense that no wall or edict could hold back the hand of death. The dance of death imagery carved into churches was not art for art's sake. It was a record of a society that saw mortality as constant companion. The fear of plague changed relationships as much as it changed landscapes. Families sometimes abandoned members at the first sign of swelling or fever. Priests fled parishes. Doctors, uncertain and afraid, prescribed remedies that ranged from herbs to charms, none effective. Archaeology adds depth to these accounts. In East Smithfield, analysis of skeletons shows that some victims carried multiple stress markers, evidence of a lifetime of hardship before the plague struck. Others were robust and well-fed, yet they too succumbed. The disease ignored wealth, rank, and strength. In the trenches, all were equal. One of the most haunting elements is the speed with which normality collapsed. In some parishes, records show marriages, baptisms, and markets continuing almost until the moment death overwhelmed. Then, silence. Excavated plague pits reflect this abruptness. Trenches begin with careful placement of bodies, each aligned. A few layers deeper, the order dissolves into hasty stacking, as if exhaustion had stripped even ritual away. The soil holds this record of decline, a progression from dignity to desperation. The psychological weight of repeated epidemics reshaped European thought. Faith was tested. Some turned more fervently to religion, joining processions and building chapels in gratitude for survival. Others turned away, doubting a God who allowed such devastation. The seeds of skepticism, of questioning authority, of demanding explanations beyond theology, were sown in this soil of loss. The plague did not only change bodies, it changed minds. Archaeology provides glimpses of resilience as well. After waves of death, survivors reclaimed land, reoccupied houses, and rebuilt churches. Fields abandoned during the plague became fertile again, tilled by fewer hands, but yielding more to those who remained. Wages rose, opportunities opened, and the rigid structures of feudalism began to crack. The evidence lies in deserted villages, in shifts in land use, and in the sudden prosperity of survivors recorded in wills and possessions. Out of death came change, though it was bought at a price too vast to measure. The climax of the Black Death story lies in this paradox. It was both annihilation and transformation. It ended millions of lives, yet it reshaped Europe in ways that defined the centuries that followed. Without the collapse of population, the rise of new social orders might have been slower. Without the shock to faith, the questioning that led to Renaissance and Reformation might have been muted. The plague carved not only graves but paths into the future. And yet, the cliffhanger remains. When the bells ceased tolling, when the pits were filled, when the streets grew quiet, survivors looked around at a changed world. The question they faced was whether life would return to what it had been, or whether something entirely new had begun. The plague had stripped away certainty. What it left was a continent waiting to see what might grow from soil watered with loss. The answer would unfold in the decades ahead, as Europe moved into a period of cultural flowering and upheaval, shaped forever by the shadow of pestilence. It often began with a whisper. In a small village at the edge of the forest, a child fell sick. A cow gave no milk, or a storm ruined the harvest. Fear needed a target, and suspicion turned toward the woman who lived alone, the one who spoke too sharply, or the one whose herbs smelled stronger than the priest's incense. What started as murmurs spread quickly. A neighbor repeated the story, a magistrate took notice, and soon a name was spoken aloud in court. The machinery of accusation was set in motion, and the fate of the accused was sealed long before the trial began. The witch trials of early modern Europe did not erupt all at once. They grew from centuries of superstition, theological debate, and social pressure. In the 15th century, manuals such as the infamous Malleus Maleficarum codified the belief that witches were not only heretics, but allies of the devil, engaged in pacts and nocturnal gatherings. The text urged authorities to root them out with fire and steel. Combined with political instability, plague, and famine, this ideology spread like contagion. From Scotland to Germany, from Switzerland to France, tens of thousands, mostly women, would be accused, tortured, and executed. Archaeology offers glimpses of this hidden terror. In Germany, excavations have uncovered pits filled with burned bone fragments, the calcined remains of those executed by fire. The warping of cranial plates and the blue-gray hue of bone reveal intense heat, confirming accounts of pyres that reduced bodies to ash. Elsewhere, protective charms have been found beneath hearthstones and thresholds, small bottles filled with pins, nails, and hair, known as witch bottles. These were not weapons of witches, but defenses against them, proof of how fear penetrated everyday life. The soil holds evidence of both the accused and the accusers, their lives bound together in superstition. The process of accusation followed a grim logic. Once suspicion took root, the accused was brought before local authorities. Testimony might come from neighbors, often describing strange behavior, muttered curses, or unexplained misfortune. Under pressure, confessions were extracted, not through reason, but through pain. Instruments of torture, thumbscrews, the rack, the strappato, were tools designed to force agreement with the charges. Skeletal remains of some victims still bear signs of this treatment: dislocated shoulders, crushed fingers, and fractures that match the methods described in trial records. Torture produced words that confirmed what the community already believed. The psychology of the trials reveals how fear became collective hysteria. Once one person was accused, the circle widened. Each confession named others, spreading suspicion like fire through dry wood. Villages turned against themselves, friends denounced friends, and families shattered. In Würzburg in the 1620s, entire communities were consumed by accusations, with hundreds executed in a single wave of panic. The bones of the victims are few, for fire left little behind, but the records of trials and the ruins of gallows remain, stark evidence of fear institutionalized. The social conditions that fueled the trials were as important as theology. Periods of crop failure, epidemic, and war left communities searching for explanations. Witches became the convenient answer. Their supposed crimes matched the fears of the time, causing illness, destroying harvests, or cursing livestock. Archaeological evidence of crop shortages, charred grains from poor harvest years, abandoned fields, shifts in diet toward cheaper substitutes, shows how fragile life was. Against this backdrop, blaming witches made sense to those desperate for control. The first part of the story is not about spectacular executions, but about how ordinary people came to believe extraordinary things. A sick child, a ruined field, a neighbor's quarrel. Small events snowballed into accusations that ended in fire. Archaeology grounds this narrative. Burned bones tell of pyres, charms tell of fear, and trial records tell of communities tearing themselves apart. What began with whispers ended with smoke rising over villages, carrying both the accused and the conscience of the accusers into the sky. The physical evidence of witch trials is often elusive, for fire leaves little behind. Yet what survives in the soil and in skeletal remains confirms the brutality described in the records. In Germany and Switzerland, archaeologists have excavated sites where pyres once blazed. Within layers of ash, fragments of bone tell of human bodies burned at extreme temperatures. Calcination, the whitening of bone under heat, appears on skull fragments and long bones. Warping and cracking patterns reveal flesh burned while still attached, rather than cremation carried out after death. These details confirm that execution by fire was not symbolic alone. It was exacted upon the living body. At other sites, the remains of gallows and execution fields bear silent testimony. In some cases, post holes and compacted soil mark where wooden structures once stood, where bodies were hanged before burning. Near one site in Scotland, archaeologists uncovered a shallow grave containing charred fragments alongside nails and iron bindings, likely the remains of a woman executed and hastily buried after the fire. Even where human remains are absent, the landscape itself bears scars. Flattened areas where pyres were built, soils blackened by repeated burning, and the traces of crowds that gathered to watch. The trial records, preserved in archives, align with these findings. They describe not only executions, but the elaborate interrogations that preceded them. Torture left marks that are sometimes still visible in bone. Dislocated shoulder joints match descriptions of prisoners suspended by their arms in the strappado. Crushed finger bones correspond with the use of thumbscrews. Broken teeth suggest forced feeding of noxious substances during ordeal. Archaeology thus confirms what written words might otherwise seem too grotesque to believe. The reach of the witch hunts was wide, stretching across Europe and eventually across the Atlantic. In Würzburg and Bamberg during the 1620s, entire towns were consumed. Hundreds of men, women, and even children were accused. The scale is recorded in mass trial documents, but archaeology adds human texture. In Würzburg, a site known as the Hexenhaus, or Witch House, was excavated. Its foundations revealed cramped cells where prisoners awaited trial and torture. Fragments of pottery, bone buttons, and scraps of iron shackles were all that remained, yet together they painted a vivid picture of lives reduced to captivity before the fire. The witch trials in Europe set the stage for those in the New World. In 1692, the town of Salem in Massachusetts experienced its own wave of hysteria. Here, the evidence is preserved less in bones than in records and artifacts. Archaeologists have uncovered the remains of foundations and personal objects from the households of the accused. They provide a glimpse of ordinary lives disrupted by extraordinary fear. One excavation revealed a buried bottle filled with nails and pins, a protective charm meant to ward off malice. Similar charms have been found in England, showing a continuity of belief across oceans. They reveal that fear traveled with migrants, shaping communities wherever they settled. The forensic dimension extends beyond execution sites to everyday objects. Witch bottles buried beneath thresholds, marks carved into door frames, and concealed shoes hidden in walls were all part of the protective arsenal of ordinary people. Archaeologists have cataloged hundreds of these finds, evidence of the widespread belief that evil could seep into households and had to be blocked. These artifacts show that even those not accused lived in constant negotiation with fear. Witchcraft was not only prosecuted in courts, it was fought in kitchens, bedrooms, and barns. The spread of hunts was not uniform. In some regions, like Spain and Italy, accusations were fewer, restrained by inquisitorial systems that demanded proof. In others, like Germany, Switzerland, and Scotland, executions reached staggering numbers. The difference reflects the interplay of local politics, economics, and culture. Archaeological findings mirror this variation. In areas of intense persecution, repeated burn layers and communal execution fields survive. In calmer regions, protective charms dominate the record, showing fear without mass killings. The social consequences of these persecutions were profound. Communities turned inward, suspicion fraying the bonds of trust. Women, especially widows and healers, bore the heaviest weight. Their bones, where preserved, tell of lives already marked by hardship, arthritis from labor, nutritional deficiencies from poverty, scars from past injuries. The witch trials did not strike at elites alone, but at the vulnerable, those whose differences were easiest to magnify. Together, the evidence of burned bone, execution fields, trial records, and protective artifacts weaves a tapestry of fear. It reveals not only how people died, but how they lived under constant threat of accusation. The witch hunts were not moments of isolated madness, but sustained campaigns carried out by institutions, codified by law and sanctified by belief. Archaeology grounds this truth in matter, reminding us that behind every name in a record was a body that bore the weight of fire, rope, or iron. The witch hunts of Europe were not confined by geography or by century. They were patterns of fear that crossed borders, oceans, and generations. By the late 17th century, the same logic that had consumed villages in Germany and Scotland appeared in New England. Salem, Massachusetts, became a stage where whispers once again turned into trials, confessions, and executions. The Atlantic had not carried settlers away from fear. It had carried fear with them. The story of Salem began in 1692 with strange fits in the household of Reverend Samuel Parris. His daughter and niece convulsed, cried out, and accused unseen forces of tormenting them. In a Puritan society already tense with threats from the wilderness and suspicion of outsiders, the accusations spread like fire. Soon, neighbors were pointing fingers, naming women whose behavior or status made them vulnerable. The machinery of accusation began to turn, echoing Europe's past. Archaeological research in Salem has uncovered fragments of this world. Excavations revealed the remains of the meeting house where preliminary hearings took place. In nearby households, artifacts such as pins, nails, and protective charms show the same superstitions found in European homes. One particularly striking discovery was a concealed shoe hidden in a wall, meant to trap evil spirits. These finds remind us that the fear of witches was not confined to courtrooms. It saturated daily life. Ordinary people lived with both dread of attack and desire for protection, turning homes into fortresses against unseen forces. The trials themselves followed familiar patterns. Accused women were pressured to confess, and many did so under duress, naming others in turn. The circle widened, suspicion multiplying until it ensnared dozens. 19 were executed, most by hanging, one by pressing under heavy stones. Though the numbers were smaller than in Würzburg or Bamberg, the psychological effect was immense. An entire community had been consumed by its own fear, its trust shattered. The comparison between Salem and Europe highlights both continuity and difference. In Europe, burning at the stake was the most common form of execution, confirmed by the calcined bone fragments found in the soil. In Salem, hanging was the punishment of choice. Yet in both cases the logic was identical. Communities faced uncertainty, whether war, famine, or wilderness, and projected that fear onto neighbors. Archaeology of execution grounds in Europe and archival work in Salem both show how ordinary life became infused with suspicion until it turned lethal. The bones of the accused rarely survive in America, for hangings and burials were carried out in unmarked places. But the records, reinforced by the physical traces of daily life, reveal the same rhythm of hysteria: accusation, confession, expansion, execution. It was a pattern that fed on itself until it burned out, leaving behind silence and regret. In Salem, survivors later received public apologies and compensation. In Europe, the victims were largely forgotten, their remains left in the ash of fields and forests. And the psychological roots of witch trials lie in the need for explanation. Misfortune demanded cause, and in societies where science could not provide it, suspicion filled the gap. Archaeological finds of charms and protective symbols show how deeply this need for control shaped lives. Even those who never stood accused believed in the threat. Shoes buried in walls, bottles filled with pins, and carved symbols and door frames all speak of a world where fear was woven into architecture itself. The nested story of Salem serves as a mirror. It shows that the witch hunts were not uniquely European, but universal responses to anxiety, difference, and vulnerability. The same structures of belief, ritual, and suspicion traveled with settlers, taking root in a new land. The witch trials were not relics of medieval superstition. They were enduring features of human psychology under pressure. What unites Salem and Europe is the way the ordinary became extraordinary. A child's illness, a neighbor's quarrel, a poor harvest, all transformed into evidence of conspiracy with the devil. Archaeology and history together confirm how these moments escalated into collective violence. Burned bones in Europe and hidden charms in America are two sides of the same coin, proof that fear is portable and that belief can cross oceans as easily as people. The legacy of these trials is measured not only in deaths, but in the scars they left on communities. In Würzburg, entire villages lost dozens to the flames. In Salem, families carried shame and grief for generations. The bones and artifacts that remind us that witch hunts were not myths, but lived experiences, where fear became law and suspicion became death. At the height of the witch hunts, fear became a spectacle. Villages and towns gathered to witness the execution of neighbors, and what might once have seemed unthinkable became ritual. Fires were lit not only to kill, but to cleanse, their smoke rising as sermons. The crowd participated with prayers, with curses, with silence. For many, to stand by was to agree, for to question was to risk suspicion. Fear tightened its grip until entire communities were bound by the same logic, watching as bodies burned or swayed from gallows. The forensic traces of this hysteria remain scattered but undeniable. In Germany, charred bone fragments from execution fields show how fires reached temperatures that warped skulls and split long bones. In Scotland, soil layers blackened by repeated burnings mark places where pyres blazed more than once. In England, the discovery of concealed charms in houses, witch bottles, iron nails, and written prayers demonstrates how ordinary families internalized the panic. Even in the absence of bodies, the land and objects preserved the atmosphere of suspicion that ruled daily life. Communal hysteria spread like contagion. In one German principality, hundreds were executed within a few years, accused by confessions extracted under torture. In Würzburg, trial records describe children as young as 10 accused and killed. In Bamberg, even the mayor and members of the council were eventually swept into the circle of accusation, proof that no one was safe once suspicion had momentum. Archaeology confirms the scale indirectly. The execution fields expanded, layers of ash deepened, and entire landscapes were reshaped by fear. The rhythm of these trials followed a grim pattern. First came misfortune, failed harvests, storms, outbreaks of disease. Then came rumors, whispers in kitchens and fields. A magistrate or priest recorded an accusation, and interrogation began. Under torture, names were spoken, and the circle widened. Soon dozens, then hundreds, were caught in the net. The community devoured itself, each victim reinforcing the logic that demanded another. Archaeological and archival evidence together show how hysteria gained structure, becoming machinery. It was not chaos alone, but system, built and maintained by law, religion, and fear. The psychological effect was lasting. Survivors lived in suspicion, afraid to speak too freely, to live too independently, or to trust too openly. Women, especially widows and midwives, carried the heaviest burden, their vulnerability magnified by poverty or knowledge of herbs. Their bones, where they survive, often show lifetimes of labor, arthritis in the spine from carrying loads, dental wear from poor diets, scars of healed injuries. They were not witches, but women already marked by hardship. Their deaths were the final blow in lives of endurance. As the 17th century wore on, the fever began to break. Skepticism grew among scholars and officials. Some judges refused to accept confessions extracted under torture. Physicians began to offer natural explanations for illness and misfortune. Yet by then, tens of thousands were gone. Fires had consumed their bodies, and soil had swallowed their ash. What remained was memory, carried in trial records, in ruins, and in bones too stubborn for flame to erase. The climax of the witch trials is not found in a single execution or a single city, but in the scale of collective hysteria. Communities turned against themselves, burning their own. The archaeology of the period tells us this was not metaphor but fact. Blackened soil, calcined bone, and hidden charms confirm a Europe consumed by fear. It was a fear that crossed oceans, shaping Salem as surely as it shaped Würzburg, a fear that revealed how fragile the bonds of trust can be when misfortune seeks explanation. As the last fires faded, a new question emerged. If communities could so easily be persuaded to kill their own in the name of purity, what else might be justified by fear? The machinery of accusation did not vanish with the end of witch hunts. It lingered in courts, in rumors, in the human need to assign blame. The bones and artifacts remain as a warning, and as Europe moved beyond the age of witches, it entered another age where suspicion found new targets, where fear once more wrote its message into bodies and into soil. From the icy silence of Ötzi's Alpine grave, to the shattered skull of a pharaoh, to the pits filled with Viking raiders and Jewish families, to the fires of crusades, plague, and witch hunts, the journey has carried us through 1,000 years of terror and testimony. The bones, the ash, and the ruins are not only remnants of death, but records of what fear can do when it takes hold of a community, a city, or a continent. Each chapter has shown us that violence and dread are as old as history itself. Yet each discovery also proves that the past cannot be buried forever. Archaeology has given voices back to those silenced, reminding us that the truth endures in matter when memory fails. The question that lingers is not what happened then, but what echoes still within us now. If fear once ruled with arrow, axe, fire, and plague, how might it return in our own age? And would we recognize it before it was too late?